So good afternoon, everyone. I'm just waiting for my title slide to start, but with that, let me start with a couple of introductions. Firstly, good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. I know that we're running a little bit late, so I appreciate you all being here, and I appreciate my panelists staying on and doing this GNF. So my name is Dr. Meenu Ratnaspapati. I am a research engineer at the Space-Enabled Research Group at MIT's Media Lab. The ever-increasing amount of space debris poses a threat to the valuable assets, and it's our reliance on these space assets coupled with the expected growth of mega-constellations of micro and nano-satellites that really emphasize the critical need for us to foster responsible behavior in space for the long-term space sustainability. So today, our panel is going to focus on addressing this orbital challenge by utilizing a rating system. So many countries and industries have already employed a rating system which improve their level of understanding of sustainability. The most well-known is often the LEED system as well as the Energy Star rating system. And this is in response to increasing energy costs as well as environmental concerns. And in the example of LEED, or the Energy Star rating system, it's constructed out of different parameters and definitions such as energy consumption, material use, etc. And it's based on a point system that's weighted by the categories. So based on this, the successes of other rating systems used in other countries and industries, and also to the need to find a collective definition of space sustainability, as well as ensure the viability, the long-term viability of the space environment. The Space Sustainability Rating was first conceptualized within the World Economic Forum. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the SSR, its definition, and my panelists here are going to give their perspectives from multilateral development organizations, agency, government, industry, as well as academia. So let's go through my panelists. Firstly, I have Nikolai Kristov, lead of the aerospace industry from the World Economic Forum. Simonetta Di Pippo, Director of the United Nations Office of Outer Space Affairs. Carissa Christensen, CEO of Bryce Space and Technology. Jennifer Warren, Vice President for Technology, Policy and Regulation at Lockheed Martin. Francesca Lezia, Space Debris Engineer at the European Space Agency, and Moraba Jah, Associate Professor at the University of Texas at Austin. I do want to remind everybody in the audience that we are going to be linking your questions. We're going to be seeing your questions here on the screens. We definitely want to get through to as many audience questions as possible. So please go to the Slido app or website to submit your questions. We're also going to be running a poll question, and what I'll do is I'll get my panelists to reflect on some of the suggestions and recommendations you have through this poll question. So given that we're a bit short of time, let's hit the questions already. So Nikolai, the World Economic Forum brings together a panel of experts at the Global Futures Council. So, and the Global Futures Council is where the SSR was first thought of and conceptualized. So why the SSR and why now?
Great question, Meenu. Thank you very much, and honored to be on such an esteemed panel here today. I think it's an excellent question. I think the council really came together and said, what is the really big pressing issue that we have in the sector, and is it really being addressed now? Is everything really being done to confront the challenge of orbital debris? And so the group coalesced around this idea is, well, there is the top-down approach, right? And that's working. You can argue about that. But what about the sort of a grassroots approach? You know, can we have something that's a little bit more dynamic, a bit more agile to complement the existing frameworks? And so quickly, everybody said, well, let's not reinvent the wheel. Let's look at things that worked in other sectors here on Earth, and let's maybe adapt it. So that's how quickly, you know, the idea of the rating was born. And, you know, the group really thought about it quite deeply about it, for about 2 years and thought about the concept. And now we're really in the process of developing it with, I'm sure you'll introduce a little bit the project team. And of course, many of you are here on the stage and in the audience. But that's really how we came around it, to say, let's do something else. Let's do something else that complements the formal framework.
You make a very good point about complementing existing frameworks. And so, Simonetta, I go to you. Under the UN Office of Outer Space Affairs, of course, is the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space Affairs. Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. UN COPUS is what I mean. These acronyms get very confusing. And recently, UN COPUS advanced and accepted 21 guidelines. How do you see the SSR complementing these existing guidelines that have just been accepted?
Well, yeah, thank you very much for the question, because this allows me to explain a little bit the process that was followed by member states under the umbrella of the Committee on the Peaceful Uses of Outer Space. So a few years ago, a working group was created. And last June, they adopted the preamble in the first batch of 21 guidelines. This is really broad because it goes under the umbrella of the long-term sustainability, and it covers several topics. But it's extremely important because, first of all, we had 92 member states, which is the current membership of the committee, which agreed by consensus on these voluntary measures, but still by consensus. And next week, I'll be in New York because the fourth committee of the General Assembly will hopefully approve the omnibus resolution, and part of this omnibus resolution will be also the endorsement of these guidelines. So next week it's quite an important step overall in the UN system. But also, that's not only let's say the positive side, the other element, very positive element, is that at the same time they agreed to establish a new working group under the Scientific and Technical Subcommittee to continue the work on LTS. For sure, the work done under this umbrella, SSR, could provide also inputs for consideration for the future. And so also, let's say, my participation to these discussions can help a lot in, being me a sort of, tool for transferring the information to our member states. Two important comments, if you allow me just 30 seconds more. First of all, it's really unprecedented that we got something like that. So it took a bit of time, but don't forget this is done by consensus, which means that all member states in the room agreed word by word, believe me, on the guidelines. And so they are really committed to implement them. And the second part is that you will see, if you read the 21 guidelines, you see, and also the preamble, you see clearly that there are several references from member states, they calling the Office for Outer Space Affairs to help in this process. And so I'm really extremely positively impressed by what's going on, and I'm even more impressed by what can happen with the upcoming new working group.
Thank you, Simonetta, and I speak for many people here that we thank you for your role and the efforts of your office for coming to a consensus on these 21 long-term sustainability guidelines. Carissa, Simonetta used the word consensus, but for the space sustainability rating to be successful, we rely on operators to implement them. What factors do you think will influence operators to take on something and be really transparent with the SSR?
Thank you for the opportunity to be here today, Manu. That's an excellent question. So this rating system is not a governmental project. Participants cannot be compelled. Companies have to feel that there is value in participating in order for the rating system to work. The good news is that the broad incentives are well aligned. If I am operating a business in space, my incentive for the long term is to ensure that I can continue to operate that business in space. So generally speaking, my incentive is to be a responsible operator and protect that environment and to not reduce my ability to operate in space. That said, there are two areas that I think are very important to think about from a business standpoint. One is the free rider problem. So broadly, the industry has that incentive, but if there are firms that are not behaving responsibly and are able to operate less expensively by doing so, then that creates a real problem for the firms a competitive problem for the firms that are incurring additional expense to operate responsibly. Now, I'm not saying that operating responsibly necessarily is dramatically more costly, but from a theoretical standpoint, it's very important that everybody be moving in the same direction. This is a very classic problem with polluters. In order to stop polluters, you need rules that make sure that everyone is prevented. And so this is a first step in that direction that takes advantage of those aligned incentives. The second point is very interesting, and it's very similar to a problem that occurs with companies facing cyber risk. So companies absolutely understand that there is a risk to their business operations from cyber incursions. They absolutely understand that it is in their long-term interest to solve those problems, but they have a difficulty in diagnosing those problems, and here's why. If I hire someone to come in and assess my company's cyber risk, I go from a situation of not knowing to knowing about a great deal of risk, and then I've got liability for addressing that risk, and I don't necessarily have the tools to do so. So it's very important that the rating works with companies to help them improve their performance and reduce their risk as opposed to creating new risk for them.
Thank you, Carissa. And again, you make a great point that it's not just good behavior for the sake of good behavior. There's other incentives that include economic incentives. So to that point, Jennifer, representing Lockheed Martin, Rick Ambrose was the first to step out and volunteer to have Lockheed Martin's satellite assess. So what does industry gain from participating in the SSR and rating their satellites, but also being part of the process from conception, design, through to having that rating?
Thank you, Manu, and thank you for including me and Lockheed Martin on this panel. A couple of things to reflect on there. The first is that Lockheed Martin has a history of engaging and working in areas of sustainability and have been recognized for it. So in the other sectors where you talked about LEED and Energy Star, we have 20 buildings that are LEED certified buildings. We have Energy Star rated buildings. So this is a process and a methodology that we recognize and reflect as important in other sectors of our operations, et cetera. So that's not unusual, but it's back to the somewhat parochial in the sense that if we look at the economy today, the space economy today, which is valued at about $350 billion, and some will project it to be $1 trillion in 20 years. The only way to get there is if we have an orbital environment that is clean and, shall we say, inviting to innovation and new applications. So it's not just about the growth of today, but it's about ensuring that there's the growth for tomorrow. It's almost an intergenerational responsibility, if you like. And it can't fall only on the space operators, but it's the partners in the entire space ecosystem. It's the manufacturers. And as a leader in that space, we feel it's very important, and perhaps it'll be a differentiator in the world of selections of manufacturers, of launch service providers, of even service providers from the satellite missions. It can all stack up and stack and rack together very importantly. I mean, if you think about the importance of science, or you think about the importance of humans in exploration over the next decades, being able to, and I'll pick on LEO just because that's, we're talking, you mentioned mega constellations, being able to transit that orbit safely so that you can have the science missions for weather, the other critical science, climate monitoring, et cetera, or you can take humans safely to the moon, Mars, and beyond. It's going to be very important that to investment and to safety and protection of life. So those are reasons why we're engaged.
Absolutely. So assuring the long-term sustainability of space means that you're also ensuring business and investment is long-term as well. Thank you. So Nikolai briefly alluded to this. So in March this year, the World Economic Forum chose a consortium of members to help define the space sustainability rating. And these members include the Space-Enabled Research Group at MIT's Media Lab, but it's also the European Space Agency, supported by the University of Texas at Austin, as well as Bryce Space and Technology, and of course, the World Economic Forum. So Francesca, representing the European Space Agency, you and your team already work on space traffic management and LTS. So why put your hand up to be part of this great group, but why put your hand up and be part of the SSR?
Hi, Minu. Thank you for your question. So at the moment, we have many different guidelines for the reduction and the mitigation of the space debris problem that apply to different phases of emissions. So starting from the design, the manufacturing, the launch, operation, and disposal. But the issue that we have at the moment is that we are not being able to have the expected level of compliance that we would like to have. And the issue with this has been that these guidelines can result sometimes in a cost, at least the first time that they are applied, or in a limitation of the lifetime of the mission payload, even if it's slightly. So the interest aspect of this SSR, the Space Sustainability Rating, is that it responds to a lack of, let's say, positive encouragement for those missions that actually are compliant with the guidelines. And another point that would be possible with this rating is also to put in the spotlight those missions that are not only compliant, but they also go beyond and implement better the required behavior. And so this is our interest in this activity.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. And I will say that we really value ESA's technical input in defining the SSR. Moriba, you are a professor at the University of Texas at Austin, very well known for space traffic management and the initiatives that you're enhancing there. You are directly working with the next generation of professionals who are going to be tackling these issues. So what role does academia play when it comes to these particular topics?
Yeah, so first of all, thank you for having me here, and great to be on this panel with everybody here present. I think, interestingly enough, because we have a lot of industrial partnerships and these sorts of things, one of the roles of academia is that we can really think about art of the possible instead of state of practice. And in terms of finding solutions, there's what can we do, very near term and kind of incremental benefits, but then there's the, okay, if you had a little moment to just actually be able to sit down and lean back in your chair and think about what could possible solutions look like, academics are very good to be able to explore those things, as well as having worked in government for over a decade. I can tell, for the Department of Defense in the United States specifically, I can tell you that open, transparent peer review and scrutiny of all things, that doesn't happen ubiquitously within the Department of Defense for a variety of reasons. And academia is very well positioned to do those sorts of things. The peer review, the scrutiny, the rigor, the tug of war between ideas in a very open and exposed environment. I would also say that one of the things that I don't see at this IAC, for instance, is a significant number of people, say, from like Russia or China, right? And I can tell you that for whatever reasons, at the technical level, in terms of a track 2 diplomacy sort of thing, academia is well suited to interface with these folks that maybe at the government level, there's difficulty, but at the academic level, we can talk about algorithms and these sorts of things and really explore the body of knowledge, the science in and of itself. And then I'll say the last role for this is that, at UT Austin, one of the things that motivated me to get involved in the SSR was I started thinking about, are there civilizations on this planet that are well-versed in sustainability? And I look at specific indigenous peoples like Inuit and the the Maori and these sorts of things, this sort of traditional ecological knowledge. And that is an impetus to try to see which tenets of these people that have found sustainability over millennia can be applied to space. And the cool thing is everybody on the stage is contributing to some of these tenets. I mean, the idea of the carrying capacity of the environment, like all these things are things that we're actually considering for the SSR. And there's any number of students that are going to be the people that actually have to apply these things. So workforce development and getting them kind of onboarded to a new way of thinking about how to utilize the environment long term and resource management, that's the final piece that I think academia is well suited for.
Thank you. And you made a really good point about the globalness of initiatives like the SSR. And what we need to do is take on the responsibility of bringing everybody to the table. So whether it be academia, industry, government, it needs to be from across the world, because if this SSR is going to be accepted, we need everybody on board from the very definition phase. So thank you very much, Mariba. So we've been running an audience poll question, and thank you very much to those who voted on this. The question is, to what extent do you consider space sustainability an important issue? And I see that only 2/3 of the audience thinks that it's a very high consideration, or we need to consider it to a high extent. Does anybody on the panel want to comment about why someone might consider this only a low or medium consideration or importance? Carissa.
So I think that this is a very, very typical of issues where there are long-term challenges and costs and benefits, and resources in addressing them compete with near-term challenges and costs and benefits. I do also think that there is an element of uncertainty regarding how severe the problem will be and when that problem will be most severe. So we've for quite some time operated successfully in space with debris as an annoyance, but generally not a major inhibitor. The debris, and I'll speak to debris as it's not the only issue relating to space sustainability, which is kind of the core issue for our conversation. It's been an annoyance, and it's been an annoyance that's been getting somewhat worse and continues to get somewhat worse, with a risk of getting significantly worse in the event of certain kinds of conjunctions or certain kinds of behaviors by countries acting in space, like anti-satellite weapons. That conversation has changed, and it's become perceived as much more urgent because our industry has changed. We've seen an influx of venture capital, we've seen new satellite form factors, and we've seen the growth of very small satellite constellations with large numbers of satellites. We've seen deployment of systems that have tens or hundreds, and the proposed deployment of systems that have thousands or tens of thousands. That's a dramatic change. The reality is, not all those systems will deploy, not all those systems, the systems that do deploy will deploy fully, not all the systems that deploy will succeed from a business standpoint. So there's a very wide range of possible levels of problem associated with the business outcomes of those operators, as well as the degree to which they act responsibly. So I think that there are some legitimate reasons to where you might have a varying view of the severity and timing of the problem, but I doubt anyone in this audience would say that over the long term, maintaining the ability to operate in space is not highly important.
Jennifer.
So I agree with Carissa. I think there's perhaps a lower sense of credibility about that some of the mega constellations will all come into existence. That said, one is significant. So I think that tees up the question. But I think there's another element that I'll add on to Carissa's list, which is fear of regulation. The new players in particular, newer, smaller sats, fear of regulation at a global level, let alone at the national level. They're comfortable to some extent with the ITU because it's already a requirement that people have successfully navigated for years. This is a new concept. And while we're talking about, and why I think the WEF initiative is so important, it's a voluntary best practices done in a multi-stakeholder environment with manufacturers, operators, governments, regulators and non-regulators of governments. That's a very important way to further safe practices without migrating immediately to regulation and seeing what is necessary. As a space community, we're very good at filling in gaps where there's abuses or problems. And this is the nice way to see how far can we go on a voluntary basis, and why, again, I think this initiative is very helpful.
Absolutely. Mariba?
I guess the thing that I want to say, in just looking at this, and the reason it's not like completely 100%, is it shows me that we have work to do in getting the entire community to first recognize that near-Earth space is a finite resource. If everybody in this room would actually agree and embrace the idea, the fact that near-Earth space is a finite resource, that would be 100%. But the thing is, there isn't that global agreement, and there's still some education and that sort of thing that needs to happen for people to realize, yeah, near-Earth space on humanity's timescales, it's not a renewable thing. Near-Earth space doesn't just self-cleanse, you know? So whatever we put there, most of it doesn't come back. And that it should be treated as a global commons. Then I feel it's very easy to extend narratives of environmental protection and these sorts of things, but until people actually accept that it's a finite resource, we don't get to 100%.
Nikolai?
Yeah, maybe something to add. I think for a lot of people it is still a little bit removed, right? I think not everybody gets the orbital dynamics. I'm not an engineer myself. It's all very distant, right? It's hard to see, you know, when you compare it to some of the challenges, the ecological challenges we have here on Earth. But I think that the timing of this is very interesting. Of course, the problem has been getting more pressing, and it's been more in the media, and the sector is discussing it more over the last couple of years. So the timing works very well, but it's, you know, look at what's happening on Earth and the discussions we've been having for the last couple of years. I mean, the discussions and the information and the updates from IPCC, you know, every year are getting more alarming. Look at the conversation that we've been having on the aviation topic this year alone. I mean, that wasn't really there. Flight shaming was not there last year. And so the industry right away is scrambling and saying, right, yes, we've been thinking about this, but now it's a little bit more urgent, we need to act, supported by scientific analysis. So I think this is really fascinating when you take the sustainability perspective, and people are waking up to this as a general concept, not just for Earth. But hey, we actually have a problem in space as well, and I think it's the element about education and explaining what's actually going on and how that's going to impact. And you know, some of the challenges in space, I mean, again, I'm not an engineer, but I think if you have a problem, it's going to be actually perhaps even more difficult to deal with it in the long term than even at least some of the environmental challenges on Earth, albeit they're very serious.
And talking about education and awareness on this topic, I think it's also our responsibility to have this conversation outside of this sector. So if we go to the energy sector, the mining sector, whatever it is, we need to let them know that the long-term sustainability of space is good for them as well. So, you know, there's so many downstream applications that we just couldn't survive without in some cases, such as me and Google Maps. So I want to just remind the audience once again that we are using Slido. Please submit your questions. And we also have one more poll questions. If we could turn to that, that would be fantastic. So let's continue the discussion. Nikolai, I want to come back to you. We briefly talked about stakeholders and engaging them at the very beginning. What is it that WEF is doing to actively engage global stakeholders from the very consultative phase?
Excellent question, and I'll be pretty quick on this. You know, it's about transparency. I think this is critical. When you're talking about some of these very complex issues, whether they're in space or on Earth, you have to bring all the key stakeholders along with you, and you have to listen to everybody as much as physically possible, and bring them in the room, and try to have everybody be part of the solution. And of course, you might not get everybody agreed. In agreement to a particular solution, especially in our case. You know, this is something actually where we recognize that we're not going to have everybody 100% aligned on everything, but the mechanism itself is set up to be, you know, as a voluntary metric, you know, maybe you only need half of the community to be on board, maybe 2/3, right? I mean, this is a little bit a moving game there. But it's about bringing everybody on board, listening to everybody, make sure that everybody understands where we're coming from and what's the journey. I think that's absolutely critical.
And your point on bringing everybody on board, Simonetta, as part of UN COPUS, you have a number of delegations that represent emerging space nations. So what advice do you have for us who are defining the SSR to ensure that we're not inadvertently causing something that might slow down the progress of these emerging space nations, or have injustices or inequalities for them to get similar ratings compared to the bigger players?
Well, first of all, I need to say that from an overall perspective, what I see, also being in the space field now for more than 30 years, I see that there is a need to speed up the processes. We do need to increase awareness on one side, so we do need to do outreach in order to explain which are the potential issues related to what we're talking about here. But at the same time, we do need to have, under the COPUS umbrella, so member states really pushing for a solution, or at least pushing for a debate which can stimulate a common understanding of the current situation and the future situation at the same time. The development in this increase of the presence of commercial players is also including, it's injecting an additional dimension, because we see clearly in the last few years and more in the future that there is a combination now of state and non-state actors. And in order to have really maintained the long-term sustainability of other space activities, we need all the players on the same ground. This is also one of the reasons why we started with the Office for Outer Space Affairs, started recently a project which is called Space Law for New Space Actors, which is it's inspired by a sort of a bottom-up approach where we want really to help new players, in particular emerging and developing countries, to start their activities in the space field with a responsible behavior. This will bring also automatically, in a way, also the various companies, so the commercial side of it in the various countries, to follow, hopefully. And at the same time, we also need a platform where we can bring all the stakeholders, because it's extremely important for top level to discuss at member states level. But then, if companies are not on the same page, if academia is not supporting the process, if the NGOs are not helping also in terms of outreach, etc., we cannot make it. So it's a question of really bringing all the stakeholders at the same table, understanding that we have a common interest here, and we have to work all together and quickly, taking actions soon.
Right. Carissa, Simonetta mentioned an rapid increase of commercial actors that are being driven by investments, markets, and new technology. What role do you see commercial actors playing in advancing the norms of behavior, sustainable long-term behavior?
A couple notes. Space has been commercial for decades. We've relied on commercial satellite operators globally to initially provide long-distance television services, then provide all sorts of television services, not just satellite TV, and now internet backbone and a wide variety of other services. What's changed about the commercial community is the kind of space actor. Smaller companies funded by venture capital, which tolerates a very high degree of business risk and seeks transformation. And so those new space actors that don't have a history of working with the government as well as commercially, don't have a history of operating under kind of conservative financial principles, there's concern about how those new space actors will behave. With regard to norms of behavior, and what is appropriate behavior in space. It's a hugely important topic, not only for considerations such as sustainability, not only for considerations such as running a business where you want to be confident that other businesses are going to behave properly and not damage you, but also from the point of view of national security. For many, many nations rely on space capabilities for their national security. And if there is conflict in space, understanding what's appropriate behavior and what's bad behavior is going to become increasingly important. Everyone's pretty much agreed that blowing up a satellite, bad behavior. But there are much more subtle and nuanced things. Are you too close to me? Are you observing me in a way that might not be appropriate? Those kinds of decisions about what is reasonable behavior need to be memorialized and articulated, but we're not starting from scratch. And so both commercial actors and civil actors that have been conducting operations for decades have helped to create a base layer of shared understanding of what is appropriate behavior. So in my view, that base layer must be infused into any future structured guidelines or standards with regard to what's appropriate behavior.
And building off your suggestion, your comment on base layer, which I think is very important, Jennifer, you co-chair the Space Sustainability Working Group at SIA, which recently came out with some principles, one of which was to say that SIA supports commercial operators that pursue a rating system. So why a rating system?
So the important part of that was the best practices rating system. Again, that's starting off, softly, trying to build a community of best practices focused on sustainability. I wanted to step back from that, though, and come back to it from another angle, which is when Simonetta talks about multilateral or talks about, COPUOS, that is government to government, and I appreciate the recognition of the importance of multi-stakeholder and businesses. We need to find a forum in which everyone is sitting together at the same table under, shall we say, their own flag or with their own little tent card so that folks can engage directly. I think that is a really important point. And the reason I think we did the SIA, one of the reasons we did the SIA principles is because even though industry could engage with government representatives or at times could be consolidated with one entity representing all, it's very hard given the myriad of technologies and capabilities to have one person be the representative of all different views and inputs and important contributions that a variety of industry participants could make to a discussion. So I think that once COPUOS adopted the LTS guidelines, it was important for industry to say what it thought, because COPUOS is a government group, shall we say, a multilateral group, body, and this was industry speaking. And I think we'd like to see that broader and have more of the different regional satellite organizations take a look at that as well and perhaps join us. But I think that's an indicator that there's a need for a baseline of multi-stakeholders in one space.
That works hand in hand, of course, right. So I want to come back to the definition of the space sustainability rating and to you, Francesca. So I will say that the definition of the SSR is still very much in the preliminary consultative phases. So after this panel, all of us are very happy to speak to anybody with comments and ideas. But one of the things we talked about, Francesca, is whether the SSR would be a fixed rating or whether missions would be evaluated every year. Based on your work at ESA, I was wondering whether you could comment on that.
Yes, so basically the main point that we should take into account here is that for the space sustainability rating, we want to focus on the operator's actions. So the idea could be that then the rating could be reevaluated if the operators change something in how they operate their missions. And this could be, for example, how they decide to share the data related to their mission, or if they change the process that they use to perform collision avoidance, for example. So because these are two of the aspects that we are considering in the formulation of the rating. And another scenario that we considered and we discussed is also the case where you have missions extensions. In that case, you also may want to recompute the rating, maybe from scratch, considering like a new mission, to take into account also which are the changes in the environment that may affect how you consider the extension of such a mission. So these are the two elements to take into consideration, basically.
Thank you, Francesca. Moriba, I know that you've got to go to another session right now, but a quick question. So you're part of this team helping define the SSR. What are we missing so far? What are the gaps in our thinking that you think we still need to address?
Well, that's a tough question. So, you know, I think, you know, the biggest thing is what are the sources of information that will flow into the SSR, and these things need to be independently measurable, repeatable, like all this stuff. So that it has to be a quantifiable thing that stands on its two legs. No matter who uses it, they need to be able to get to the same, kind of the same answer, right? Given the set of weights, they can get to the same answer. But I think the thing that's probably the biggest gap is, again, in terms of sustainability, I'm thinking about these sorts of sustainability in other domains, and I see three spheres needing to come together. One of them is ethics, and so you can find some of that, you know, peaceful uses of outer space, prevention of arms race, you know, for sustainability. The other piece is practice. How do people practice operations in space? Different cultures put that into practice a bit differently. And then the last piece is the knowledge base that you have in terms of how long have you been operating in space. New actors, not so much as far as other people that have maybe been flying in space in Sputnik, right? But when we talk about behaviors, the interesting thing to me is that we can all agree that when we go to different countries, people don't behave the same way. So I think that the interpretation of sustainability guidelines is very important because, you know, you talked about, well, are you too close to me? Are you looking at me in a way that I don't like? So there's this cultural competency that needs to be applied, because I think we can have general behavior, but then we also have to have cultural competency in some of that as well. And being able to respect when somebody says, listen, I don't like when you stare at me, so please don't do that. Okay, everybody, Jimmy is somebody who you never look at for long periods of time because Jimmy gets upset. But this is the level that we need to eventually get to. Because if we try to do the Lord of the Rings, one size to, you know, rule them all kind of stuff, I think we don't get there because each cultural nuance gets in the way. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thanks, Moriba, for being here with us. So I want to ask my panelists, who, by the way, now are really majority women to men, thanks, Nikolai, to reflect on this poll question. So what do you consider to be the most effective mechanism towards supporting the long-term space sustainability? I will say that there is no wrong answer. We need all of these and more. But Simonetta, you have the microphone in your hand. Can you comment on this?
Well, first of all, let me say that, well, I've been involved in this endeavor, let's say, since the beginning. And I believe it's a great result of a great job of the future councils of the World Economic Forum. So I would like to take the opportunity to mention that, because I do believe is really this is something that was missing, at least in the panorama. And also, I would like to consider and to underline the fact that the team which was created to do this job is outstanding. So having said that, on the long term, I will say that we probably need to look for a host which will be impartial and neutral and independent, inclusive, you name them. I don't want to say that we are the ones. We have all these characteristics for sure, but we will see. In any case, what I believe is extremely important is that, again, the work that you have been doing, also the involvement of operators in and companies like Lockheed Martin, I really welcome that. I believe we are really on the right track, and let's work on together to have this a great success.
Does anybody else want to comment on this, Francesca?
Yes, so I want just to say that this response is really in line also with ESA vision, because basically the idea that it's present at the European Space Agency is that the space debris is really a global issue. It's a threat to the whole near-Earth environment, and so only a globally agreed solution will work in the long term. And this means that this creates the needs for international agreed guidelines. And this is really necessary to have a common understanding on how to solve the problem, and also to have comparable processes. And this is, so let's say, the first point that we have here in the question. Of course, then it's up to individual states and nations to translate this principle. And of course, we welcome all this voluntary action by operators. As I said in the beginning, is really what makes you do these additional steps. So to go, the state tells you which is the minimum level, the minimum requirement, but then the operators can take this one step forward to promote this better than required behavior. So this is very important as well.
Nikolai?
I think the answers actually are pretty right on. I mean, I would tend to think, the international regulations are absolutely key, right? This is the first level. The policy and regulations, we wouldn't have our modern society today with our way of life if we didn't have governments setting the tone, and that's policy, that's regulations. And, we're going to have more of that as we expand the space sector. And of course, that's a long process that takes time, a lot of actors involved, a lot of national interests. That's understandable. But that's absolutely key, and I think that answer coming first is absolutely right. But then there are other metrics, and these other mechanisms work very well. They supplement, they complement, and they do an extremely important job because they're more agile. Now, for our rating, I mean, let's be honest. We're gonna still have quite a lot of work to do. There are going to be some hard questions, some hard decisions to make. Not everybody's going to be happy. But we need to shift the narrative, and I think this is what we're doing with this effort. And that narrative will then incentivize some of the stakeholders perhaps who have not been thinking about this in the same way to reconsider some of the actions, right? And that's powerful. But also the value is in actually having this conversation, debating some of these parameters.
Jennifer?
So I think the success of the voluntary approach will be somewhat indicative of what level of international governance, I'll call it, is required. And I think we can look even more creatively if we look at the internet space and we look at a body called ICANN. That's a very creative alternative to a global internet regulator. We need to think about things that are not the norm, but may offer solutions that are in lieu of an intergovernmental body, which when we look at the space actors, we're looking at states, commercial entities, parastatal entities, et cetera. We've got a lot of different actual universities. We have so many different participants in that economy that we're going to really need to be creative in the governance model and the way that people participate and entities participate.
And I think that the final note that I'll offer is, in thinking about a multinational commitment to preserving the space environment, the only way that happens is if the benefits of the space environment are broadly experienced. And so that is both a reality of expanding those benefits and also a perception in communicating those benefits. So that, as well as, I agree with Jennifer, the lightest possible touch that achieves the goal so that the regulatory structure does not get in the way of innovation that creates those benefits through business activities is critically important.
Right. And I think that's a great time to end our panel. I want to be respectful of the panel that comes straight after us. So in this case, we're going to skip past the questions, but I do invite everybody in the audience to please come up to us and ask your questions. I know we would all be very happy to answer them. I also want to add that Francesca and I will be presenting a technical paper at A6.8 tomorrow morning. It's a paper that we've written on the development and definition on the SSR and goes into a little bit more detail. The paper will also be available through the conference proceedings. So with that, I thank my fantastic panelists for each of their important perspectives and yeah, let them off the stage. But thank you very much.